The memory of uMkhulu Robert Sobukwe is one that has not found sufficient expression, particularly in the post-1994 dispensation. This is considering the fact that his voice, his utterings, and his ideas were prohibited by the apartheid regime. We held a series of conversations to establish the impact of uMkhulu Robert Sobukwe's ideas on various individuals to invoke his name and his memory. These conversations are with a cross-section of individuals whom uMkhulu Sobukwe has touched in one way or another.
My own identity is interwoven with his own identity, in that the house to which he was confined after he was moved and not released, after he was moved from Robben Island to Galeshewe, the house number 6 Naledi Street is a house I grew up in, which was under the care of the Manong family. And as a child, and I did not obviously know about him at the time, but I literally walked, in the same place where he used to eat, to sleep, and to breathe, And obviously, with the much of time later, I got to learn about the importance of that place, that house number 6 Naledi Street. And obviously, as one became more aware of what that house means, its historical significance, and as somebody who had a passion for history at an early age, I obviously then began to make the connections, right?
When I was still a young boy, we used to collect water. We had communal taps in the streets. And I was at the tap, which is now fortunately the street where I grew up on, where I grew up in number 2, is right, it goes right into Sobukwe's office door. If you are at Sobukwe's door, you look into Polisa Street, which is where I was born. So whilst at the tap, because we had to queue for, to get your chance to get water, I saw this neatly dressed gentleman, tall. And, he was so neatly dressed. Now imagine, during those times, Galeshewe people, we were living in abject poverty. And this guy was so neatly, but he was greeting everybody in the street. And then people whispered, yeah, this is Sobukwe, and this is Sobukwe, and all of that. And I mean, during that time, I was in high school by then. So I've heard about the name Sobukwe and could relate it to Mandela then. And so that was the Sobukwe I saw. And then afterwards, fast forward, so one day we were sitting at the office, at the outside of his office, as we usually do. And you must know by then the security police could see them roaming around because the road was going through it. Now it's making it's meandering behind the office. So one day we are sitting outside, having our cold drinks, we are talking. But we didn't see Prof going into the office. As usual, sometimes we could see him being dropped, but that day we did not see him. So the secretaries, they locked and off they went. And then we started singing. It was a bit late. We started singing outside the office. We sang, singing Zabalazo, because it was now 77, I think. So yeah, 77, 78, early 78. We are singing, and we are making a noise outside his office, not knowing that he's inside. We only saw the door open When he opened the door, when we saw him, he came out and then said, "Gentlemen," and we just ran in two different directions. And it looked like, it was like we were sabotaging, but we did not. It was not sabotage. We did not know that he was in there.
He's got a very fascinating childhood, right? In the sense that one of the things that you see in his childhood, that at an early age he was very studious. He loved books, right? He loved books, and he was introduced to books at home. So by the time he actually went into formal schooling, he already had a very healthy relationship with books, and his aptitude was very well developed. So he loved books. And this is why at an early age, he was already an academic high performer, even before he went to university at Fort Hare, a high performer academically. So you see those things in his childhood. And he also loved music. One of the things that I often talk about, that he also had a love for music. It was obviously not as pronounced as his love for political leadership, but he also had a love for music. And so when he goes to Fort Hare, and this is the important thing to say, that he's not politically active when he is doing his lower education, right? So he's not politically active, but he's very studious, very academic, very intellectual at the time. His intellectual talents are beginning to blossom. So he becomes politically active when he gets to Fort Hare University, right? And one of his influences there is one of his lecturers, Mr. Godfrey Peche, who was one of his lecturers, I think, in native administration. That's one of the courses he did at Fort Hare. And it is through his interaction with the academic lessons that he encounters and his discussion with the lecturer, Ubabu Godfrey Peche, that his political consciousness about the African condition gets awakened, right? And then that leads to him becoming politically involved at Fort Hare. So at Fort Hare, he becomes a student leader. He becomes a member of the SRC, president of the SRC, actually. And he also becomes involved in the Congress Youth League, what we know today as the ANC Youth League. He becomes a member of the Congress Youth League. So that becomes the first political structure that he joins. And he then becomes part of a generation that also forms part of the first core of the leadership of the Youth League, right, of the 1940s, which is that Youth League of the brilliant Ubaba Umuziwakhe Lembede. So he becomes part of that group, and he was greatly influenced by the thinking Ubaba Umuziwakhe Lembede, who was the first formally elected president of the ANC Youth League. The ANC Youth League had a leadership under Ubaba Nkomo, who was almost like a chairperson of a steering committee that was taking the ANC Youth League in 1944 to a elective Congress. But the first president is Ubaba Umuziwakhe Lembede, who was the leader, Mangaliso Sobukwe. And they had a very strong intellectual culture, and they were influenced by a number of ideologies, amongst which the ideology of Africanism, and which was part and parcel of the manifesto of the ANC Youth League, which I regard as one of the most advanced documents. And I always say to people, go and read the founding policy and manifesto of the ANC Youth League. It's one of the most advanced documents to read, just in terms of their grasp of our condition as Black people, but also, which is something that a lot of people in political leadership struggle to do. It is one thing to have a good critique or analysis of a condition, but it's another to move from critique to propose an alternative vision, which is what they were able to do. That's why I'm saying that document is very advanced, and you must go and read it. And what it means to me is he entrenches a number of things. So the first thing is the pride of just being a Black man in this world, because if you look at our history, the most attacked species in the world or in our history is the Black man. And he is one of those Black men who, through time, stood, head and shoulders and chest out and walked chest out. And so he exudes that pride. And just my interaction with him as a figure inspires that. Then there is also another aspect, his love for our people and our continent. You have very few people during his time and now who love Black people and who love the African continent like he did. And to demonstrate the point, he was so gifted, brilliant, intellectual, and even academically. And he chose the path of leading the liberation struggle as opposed to the natural social mobility that would have come with his academic training. Because for him, the project of liberating and advancing his own people was more fundamental. And for me, that's how he demonstrated that love. And he was also fully aware, if you read his writings, that came with its own dangers, but he nevertheless stood firm on that path. And so for me, he represents all of those things, and more fundamentally, he just represents the pride of being a Black person who does not quiver, right? Or who does not find themselves, who shudder at the feet of whiteness, right? And it's a very fundamental thing to have. He has got a very elegant fearlessness, So there is a fearlessness, that is very boisterous, that is in your face. My own understanding of Ubaba Mangaliso Sobukwe is that he had an elegant fearlessness, which was not in your face, but it was palpable, almost something majestic about his fearlessness, because he did not have to tell you he's fearless. But if you were discerning enough, you could tell he was arguably one of the most fearless Black people that ever lived, And that's really what he represents for me at a sentimental, emotional, intellectual, and spiritual level. Those are the types of feelings and sentiments he evokes in me.
He chose us, if you have to put it like that. And that's the effect that he had. I never spent time with the old man, but whenever we enter the space, I can feel his presence. That's the funny thing about it. And I think, I don't know how many years was that before we could even start Galeshewe. And whatever we do, I think that was always the aim and the goal, that can we then replicate what he did under difficult circumstances. And I think that's what keeps us moving forward when we occupy the space, and when we do what we do to create a better tomorrow for all of us.
Indlela enimkhumula ngayo mnandi. Ndimkhumbula ngento ba ayimele into ayimeleyo, abe staunch African, angathengisi abantu base-Africa.
A good man, upright, just smoking his pipe and always greeting anybody, everybody. And people used to flock knowing that this man is under house arrest. Yeah, everybody wanted to know him.
The impression of the man is big shoes. My impressions of the man is that Kimberly is privileged to have had a person of that stature working our streets. I feel privileged that today I can sit in a space where he was sitting and he was doing community work. And today we are also doing community work. So I feel privileged that the people that would come to the space and the stories that they would share about the man. There is one elder schoolboy. He normally also would pop in and he would tell us that he used to be the chauffeur of Robert Sobukwe, and he would share stories, even the time when Steve Biko came to Kimberley. So for us, just to be seated here, just to be covered by his spirit and to be embraced by that aura, we are just in a position of being very privileged as a person that was young and I'm growing older, and also to have that We cannot trade that for anything.
They made us realize that we are human beings.
The passionate about us as African people. And it's so sad that we cannot unite and be one. Sithethe language A1 singabantu. Not language as in language, but sithethe into enye uba. Way forward, let's do away with izinto zase-West. Bubunvile indlu kutsha, yabona. Umuntu uyazazi ukuthi I cannot speak any old how because ndinezihlwele ezilapha kum ezingayithandiyo into embi, yabona. Kum ke it starts up.
And this is also why Ubaba Mangaliso Sobukwe is such a special human being, because he was also deeply endowed with the vision for Africa and her people. So he carried on his shoulders an understanding of where African people should be. So in addition to being opposed to injustice and hating white supremacy, racism, etc., he also had an idea as to what type of society, what type of Africa do we want to create, right? So he had moved that far in his thinking. And of course, their youth league, and he played a big part of it. One of the most important contributions that they made, and it's something we continue to struggle with today, they came to an analysis, and Steve Biko comes to this analysis much later. Obviously, he could not have come to that analysis earlier because he was not born at that time, right? But he comes to the same conclusion later. And what is this conclusion? The conclusion that the liberation struggle in South Africa, as in other parts of the continent, was under the control, ideological and intellectual, of white liberals. They were determining the language, they were determining the forms of struggle. And their contribution as the Youth League was to try and wrestle the ANC, the Congress, right, the Congress movement, from the control and the influence of white liberals, right? And this is why they played a big part in influencing what is called the 1949 program of the ANC, program of action, because it was very Africanist in its orientation, which meant it centered African people. So he makes those types of contributions, right? And of course, after that project does not succeed within the ANC, he and others who were of the Africanist persuasion then leave the ANC to go and form what we today know as the Pan-Africanist Congress of Azania, the PAC. And it is important for us to understand the PAC as a continuation of the Africanist project that was started under the leadership of Ubaba Muzwa Kelembete and Ubaba Mangaliso Sobukwe being a protagonist of that project that was started. And it is important to make that historical connection. And the history of the PAC actually has to be traced from the founding of the Congress Youth League, Kababu Muzwa Kelembete.
He knew what he wanted. Umhlaba sikawufumane namhlanje. Kusalawula iBritain. This is my personal opinion.
A liberation struggle of the Northern Cape, is one of the people who has played a part in the Northern Cape that has been mentioned in there.
The sacrifices he has made are incalculable, right? Because, and I always make the point that, when you are you are fighting for a cause and you get killed while fighting for the cause, that is a price to pay. And it's a very supreme price because, like Nikolai Ostrovsky says, that man's greatest possession is life and it is given to him but once, right? And you can't do anything if you are dead. But at the same time, right, it is also possible to make sacrifices that are greater than death. And one of those sacrifices is to dedicate your life to your people for the rest of your life. It is a sacrifice that in some context can actually be more greater than death. In the sense that you are so conscious, you are so aware as you make that sacrifice, and you can tell what that sacrifice is taking from you, but you continue to do it. You continue to. A dead person doesn't have that option, you know. Now, he is one of those who, for the majority of his conscious life, which is from his early 20s, for the majority of his conscious life, he was preoccupied with one thing and one thing only: the dignity of the African people. And everything that he did, even in his private life, centered around that purpose, that he must see himself making a contribution to defending or to elevating the dignity of African people. And this is why for him, and it's another important lesson, many of the people who are called leader today, you know, a title that I find horribly misplaced and misapplied, because many of the people who are called leader today are actually the opposite of what leaders should be. And Ubabu Mangaliso Sobukwe is a fundamental lesson in selfless leadership and compassionate leadership, leading with compassion, right? And you see that in that he always understood that whatever privileges accrued to him are privileges that he must share as much as possible with others. So he was never interested in what they say in Xhosa, ukusengela emlonyeni, you know. So in Xhosa there is this thing where abafana bayathunywa ukuthi bayosenga inkomo ukuze babuye ngamasi wasendlini, amasi wasekhayeni. Now abanye abafana, while they go there bayosenga, and when the elders are not looking, babhizi ngenkomo, bathatha lanto yenkomo, olabisi lenkomo basengela emlonyeni. They were sent to go and ukuyolanda olabisi for ikhaya, bona basengela emlonyeni. Now one of the things ngoba uSobukwe ebengasengeli emlonyeni.
What a man Sobukwe was.
I also would like to stay in a modern house. Modern, you know. But the spirit, it seems like that, but still now, there is that spirit that is in here, that you can't demolish anything. No, you can't. Kinda emotional. So,
and you got
that is a legacy that anybody who will be in charge of this house must keep it. It must go on. Yeah, and people out there must know. They must know that this man really, really worked hard. But by then, my husband was alive. So there were these people from France, from Iceland, or is it Iceland? Yeah. They wanted the house. And the offer was huge. But we couldn't. Why should we do it? Because it is a South African legacy. That's what my husband felt. I used to say to him, hey man, the money, let's look at the money. And said, no, Angela, money is nothing. Money is nothing. We have to keep the legacy. Because truly speaking, money is nothing. I mean, compared to this great man. Yeah. Knowing that nobody, nobody ever, you know, getting respected or kept the legacy. So we had to, knowing what he did for this country, we had to.
A very important part of our history, also because to understand his personal circumstances. So at the time that the PAC takes that decision, he is still an academic at Wits University who travels by train from Soweto every morning, you know, to go and do his academic work. But then after the PAC takes that decision to start the positive action campaign, and then he then decides as the leader, right, one of the things he must do is to tender his resignation at Wits University, to give priority to this important project. And this is something that's not often said, that by the time the uprising happens, he had proactively resigned, he had made that sacrifice. And you must remember, this is a family man, this is a father, essentially taking a decision that could jeopardize the livelihood of his own family for something that he believes is much more fundamental. So he does that. And this was a national program of the PAC, which was directed at, amongst others, right, exposing and rendering as illegitimate the authority of the colonial government. So a lot of people want to reduce it to the anti-pass campaign. The overall objective of the campaign was to actually show how illegitimate the very colonial government and system is. And part and parcel of using the pass campaign as a platform was to simply defy this very illegitimate system. And it's important that it be understood like that. So people shouldn't say they were fighting against Amapas. They were not fighting against Amapas. They were trying to help Black people understand that we have an illegitimate system in our country, and we must not legitimize it by acquiescing or by obeying its laws. And that was one of the levels at which they decided to engage with this illegitimate system. And it's important that we have that mental note, right? And this obviously then leads to a set of activities, right, which include, amongst others, he and the other leaders of the PAC getting arrested en masse. But also, this then also leads to mass protests where other Black people in other parts of the country, in Cape Town, in places like Langa, in Uitenhage, in the Eastern Cape, joining into this campaign, right? Now, we also know that this then leads to what is today referred to as the Sharpeville massacre, right? But it is important to then understand the other significance of this moment in terms of its impact and how it shaped our political trajectory as a country. So the decisions that were taken under the leadership of Sobukwe, Positive Action Campaign, Langa in Cape Town and Langa in the Eastern Cape and Sharpeville, all of that led to a number of things. The first one, it led to the banning of the PAC and the ANC. So when people talk unbanning of political parties, it's also important for them to understand when and why they were banned. Had it not been for what the PAC had done, the ANC and the PAC would not have been banned. So this happens as a direct result of the action that was taken by the PAC and Babu Sobukwe. Then another thing happens. Obviously, there was a piece of legislation that was passed in haste, right? The Unlawful Organizations Act, that was supposed to then enable the banning. But then there's another thing that also then happens during that period, which is very significant. The one other thing that happens is that there is a groundswell of international pressure on the illegitimate racist apartheid regime as a result of what happened in Sharpeville. And why is this important? Another thing that is also not said, and we recently discovered through investigation, there is a credible suggestion that the numbers that the apartheid regime reported on the people who were killed during the Sharpeville uprising were grossly underestimated. That it was not the 69 that people talk about and the over 200 that were injured. They were more. And the same thing can be said about 1976. The numbers were more, right? And it is something that was only recently, brought to the surface, which means there is also a need for us to go back to what we call the Sharpeville massacre and the related ones, the Langa massacre and the other ones in Cape Town, to go and correct that part of our history. So that then happens, then there's a lot of pressure on the apartheid, the colonial regime. Then that decision leads to another third thing, which is the decision, the positive campaign. It leads to the founding of the two armed wings of the ANC and the PAC, right? APLA and uMkhulu Wesizwe. APLA and uMkhulu Wesizwe are a direct result of the PAC's positive action campaign. Now, if you hear the statement that is made in hiding by Ubabu Mandela, where Ubabu Mandela says it is futile and useless, I'm paraphrasing him, it is futile and useless to continue talking peace and non-violence with a regime whose only reply is violence against our people. I'm sure many people have heard that. That statement itself is a direct result of the apartheid regime's reaction to the events that sparked Sharpeville, which were led by Sobukwe. So that you have Mkhonto Wesizwe later, that you have APLA, is a direct result of that. But what it also then does, it then also ushers in another critical phase of the liberation struggle in South Africa. Again, Ubabu Sobukwe as a catalyst. What the phase that is called the armed struggle, right? So again, you cannot talk about the armed struggle and you don't talk about the events that were led by Ubabu Sobukwe and the positive action campaign, because sequentially you can see the connection to all those sets of events. So the point that one is making is that our own history as a country and as a people is intricately linked to the person Ubabu Sobukwe. You know, that in a quiet way, he has influenced so much of our history that many of us don't even realize. You know, and it is a tragedy that the manner in which we remember that very history, his name does not appear. In spite of the fact that he, like others, made incalculable sacrifices for that history to be possible. For people to go into exile, as we hear today, people went into exile, you have to go back again to the positive action campaign of the PAC, because that's what sparked the formation of the armed wings, like I said, and the armed struggle. So the question to ask is, when you make the point in your question that it seems like the treatment of him being ignored and erased seems to continue after 1994, the question that raises, amongst many other questions, is the system that prevails after 1994, is it a different system from the one that existed before 1994, right? Because if it meets out the same treatment on the same person, even posthumously, the only conclusion to come to is that it's the same system, albeit in different form. Probably there's got different managers, because if it's a different system, it should behave differently towards the legacy of Ubabu Sobukwe. If it's a different system. Now, because it is not a different system, right, it perpetuates that, it continues to do that.
Most people were afraid of Prof, to be associated with him. We could see it as youngsters. But there were some people who really, you could see them with him, but others were just avoiding him. He was like a cancer in the society. But as I say, there were people who could be with him, like Brascola also. Could see Brascola also driving his car. And his office was always full of people, people coming for legal advice, and also, leaders like Sobukwe then, you read what they have done, or you listen to people telling stories about Sharpeville. Now, for a person to tell people that on March the 21st, everyone leave your parcels at home. Don't come with your parcels. Go to the police station, the whole of South Africa. Go to the police station and hand yourself over. I mean, the president, imagine, let's say there were about 12 million people, black people by then. All the 12 million people could go to police stations and say, arrest me, I don't have a pass. You are causing chaos. Now, a leader who can achieve that is very dangerous to your to the apartheid system. So whatever Sobukwe was saying, you could the message is there.
How important it is to make the link, right, between the contribution Kabau Sobukwe and how it influenced the struggles, especially of students in 1976, right? So the connection between the 60s and the 70s, so to speak. That is an important thing to also highlight, because one of the mistakes in how we retrieve or tell our history, right, that we create superheroes and superheroes in our history, right? So people who think they are the first to do things, right? I mean, for instance, I just want to digress a bit, but to make the point, if you look at what students today call the struggle for decolonization, right? If you go and read the things that Ubabu Sobukwe was raising in his speech as an SRC president in October 1945, I think, right? 1949, sorry, October 1949. You go and read that speech that he wrote, right? You can tell, you know, if you have any reasonable grasp of concepts such as decolonization, that he understood and grappled with the issue of decolonization of education, even from there. If you go to what happened in 1976, right, you read the work and the speeches of Tsietsi Mashinini, Khotso Seatlholo. If you go back to Nkgopotse Tiro, they dealt with the concept of decolonization. So I'm just trying to show the point that some of the things that are presented as new struggles today are not really new, right? They may have been called by different names, but the essence of the fight is not new. And so this is to make the point that the Black consciousness movement, right, that is birthed in the late 60s, 1968, and then formally launched in 1969 under the leadership of uKhamela Omhle, uBantu Biko. In its own documents, acknowledges that it draws from the struggles of those who came before them. Even in their formulation of the idea of Black consciousness, if you read, for instance, the document, the definition of Black consciousness, and a lot of people don't pay attention to this point in that document, where that document says the phenomenon of Black consciousness manifests itself throughout the third world, which seems to suggest that Steve Biko and his peers understood that they did not invent Black consciousness. They simply did what is called situationalized it to the South African reality as they understood it. But they made a formal acknowledgement. So they've never gone around and said they invented Black consciousness, right? So they understood there were people who had articulated Black consciousness even before they were born. And in fact, if you are not too intellectually lazy, there's a text, Kababa Muziwake Lembete, where he talks on white liberals. And when you look at what Ubabu Steve Biko later writes also on white liberals, you would suspect they had spoken to each other. Because the philosophical framing, but also the conceptual framing, and even the wording is so similar, right? Which just shows this connection. So what happens in 1976, and if you listen to many of the students who were in the leadership, right, not the students who found themselves in the crossfire, but the students who were in the leadership, many of them were influenced by the ideas of people like Mangaliso Sobukwe, you know. And to show you this point, the leadership of the Black consciousness movement, Babu Steve Biko, consulted so many times with Ubaba Mangaliso Sobukwe, you know, consulted so many times with Ubaba Mangaliso Sobukwe on their own programs, you know. In fact, when Ubabu Steve Biko was banned, just like Ubabu Mangaliso Sobukwe, they made an effort to go and see him at Galeshewe to show the connection, that it was not just theoretical. They made an effort to go and see him, and they drew a lot. But here's the other influence that you also see. The concept of Azania, that is later adopted by the Black consciousness movement, is a concept in the South African context that was made popular by the PAC. But later you see the Black consciousness also adopting the concept or the name of Azania as a name for a liberated South Africa yet to be born. So that connection was conscious amongst the core of the leadership of the Black consciousness movement. But this is also why the leadership of the Black consciousness movement played such a leading role in making sure that the funeral arrangements in Babu Mangaliso Sobukwe happen in a dignified way. because they understood the connection and they regarded him as their leader. And if you go and read I Write What I Like, there's a letter that a young Steve Biko in his 20s writes to the US Senator Dick Clark on the 1st of December 1976. In that letter, a young Steve Biko in his 20s calls on the United States of America to put pressure on the apartheid government. And one of the things that he demands in that letter is the release of the leaders of black people. And he mentions, amongst others, Ubaba Mangaliso Sobukwe, Ubaba Nelson Mandela, and the leaders of the black consciousness. This is a Steve Biko who's in his 20s. Right? So I'm just trying to make the point about how the leadership of the black consciousness movement understood that they were not self-made, right? There were people who came before them, and they had the decency and the magnanimity to acknowledge people like Ubaba Mangaliso Sobukwe. While he is there, first important thing to understand is that he was given a separate cell. It's another important thing for our children to understand. He was given a separate cell. He was isolated from all the prisoners, for the rest of his stay there. He was given a separate cell. It's now referred to as the Sobukwe House. And he was denied one of the most basic things that a human being needs, human interaction. So if you read How Can Men Die Better by Benjamin Pogrund, right? A story is told in that book about how when the other prisoners would go and do hard labor and they passed by his house, and because they knew their leader was in there, one of the ways they communicated with him was to take part of the soil, right? And then with the soil in the palm of their hands, lift it and let the soil gently drip through their hands, as they can see him, right? And that was some kind of a spiritual message of saying, we are children of the soil and we see you, son of the soil. Even though they deny us access to you, we see you, son of the soil, right? But what it also meant is that they also were communicating that we understand that our struggle is essentially about land. That we call ourselves sons and daughters of the soil is not a fashion statement. It's to help us understand our connection to the land. So he's put in that separate cell. But then there's another thing that also happens while he is there. A sort of strange things happen, right? At times he gets medical treatment without the knowledge of unkosikazi wakhe, umama uZonde, who is popularly known as Umamu Veronica, who was a nurse, right? He gets medical treatment without the knowledge of umama. And there are some of us who suspect that all sorts of things could have been done to him by the system at the time, because he was not there because the system loved him. He was there because the system actually wanted him dead if they could. And they were just looking for having to find a way. Now, his being there also is equally important in the sense that he's the only political prisoner who was treated in this way, right? And, incarcerated and put in a separate cell, far away from the general population, as it's called. And the Minister of Injustice at the time, when asked why it is Sobukwe is treated that way, says that he has got a magnetic personality. And if you put him in contact with people, he can easily influence people. And later they then pass what is called the General Laws Amendment Act, right, which is colloquially known as the Sobukwe Clause, which gives the Minister of Injustice the power to extend his sentence, right, without him having to commit any offense. And the minister is able to do that arbitrarily, and which is what happened. And this is why this then later becomes known as the Sobukwe Clause, because it was passed as a result of his incarceration, and it was applied to him only, and it extended his stay. And remember, we also made the point that even when he had served his full term in Robben Island, his imprisonment was extended by another 9 years when he was banished to Galeshewe. So it's another important part of our history as well that we must really retrace carefully about when he was there and what his time was like and the type of things he was put through, and whether or not the agenda was for him to die there. His influence when he was in Galeshewe and the role that he has played also in influencing other people, and him, deciding to pursue a law degree, right, while he was there. Now, you mentioned another important person, Ubaba Nzimande. Now, had it not been because he used the office Kababa Nzimande for him to do because you need to have a address when you apply, right, as a law student. You have to have an address, and it must be a firm of attorneys. So Ubaba Nzimande gladly offered that. But then it is also important to mention another elder, right, who helped him with his administration, who unfortunately left us recently, right, Ubaba Zephania Ngwenye, because his ability to acquire a law degree and receiving administrative support was assisted by Ubaba Nzimande, but also by Ubaba Ngwenye, who was his administrator, who we lost recently. May his soul rest in peace. And it is one person that we must also bring to the fore, because he was very central to welcoming Ubaba Sobukwe and the family of Sobukwe in Galeshewe. Ubaba Ngwenye is very important. So as he does that, one of the things that he then does is that before he even influences other people in Galeshewe to pursue law, he then takes up cases of people at no charge in Galeshewe, helps to represent black people at no charge, and make sure that they get whatever form of justice they can get in an unjust system. Of course, it's very important, because there can't really be true justice in an unjust system. But whatever little legal victories people could get, he helped in those, and he never used to charge people, because he always said to them, he doesn't know how to charge them. And he helped people. And it is also important to know that he walked, right? He was not driving around as he was traveling between his office and the magistrates' courts and other places. He walked in the streets of Galeshewe, with his bag, and he would stop and greet people. And it would take him forever to get home, because he would stop at any point to talk to people. Also, probably because he has been denied for a long time human interaction. He would do that. Now, one of the people that he influenced amongst many is Umama Yvonne Mokgoro, who became, if I'm not mistaken, one of the first black female justices of the Constitutional Court after 1994. As a young girl, Umama Yvonne Mokgoro had interaction with Ubaba Sobukwe. And when Ubaba Mangaliso Sobukwe realized her brilliance, Ubaba Mangaliso Sobukwe said to a young May Yvonne Mokgoro, "You must pursue a career as a lawyer," And she eventually became one of our most respected jurists in the country, black female jurist. That was one of his influence. But here's another very interesting influence, Kababu Sobukwe. As a native of Galeshewe, I know at least 5 people I grew up with who were named Robert Mangaliso by their parents as a result of how much their parents revered Ubaba Sobukwe. I went to school with a couple of them. One of them is my cousin, Robert Mangaliso Mutavi, directly named after Ubaba Mangaliso Sobukwe. So his influence is really immeasurable, And I always say that, there is something in the name Kababu Mangaliso Sobukwe. This name Mangaliso, a wonder, something which you can't particularly quantify, you can't particularly understand, but also something you should not stress about understanding, because that's the beauty about a wonder. You must just wonder at it, And Europeans don't understand that you don't understand something does not make you intellectually insufficient, right? Because that's also the other beauty of being human, that sometimes to not understand is also to know. When you don't understand, you also don't know, And you should be happy also not knowing, because it means you know that you need to be happy not knowing, right? And I'm just trying to now, make us understand that if you look at the relationship between the name Babu Mangaliso and the impact he has had on the lives of people, and doing it quietly and gracefully, no noise, no boisterousness. But when you look at the influence of Babu Sobukwe, you see it. And a lot of that also, I'm not saying it isn't, but I don't think what I've shared now, for instance, is documented anyway. Why he was such a feared man, right? It's a very involved question, and it's important for us to then understand also the system that Babu Mangaliso Sobukwe, Steve Biko, Chris Hani, and others were up against. The system of white supremacy and anti-blackness. That system also studies the people it oppresses. There are people in the system of white supremacy and capitalism who sit, and their business is to sit and look at these people that you call your leaders. They analyze each and every one of them, and they make certain conclusions about them. Which ones amongst them can be bought? Which amongst them cannot be bought? And they then devise a strategy to deal with all those groups of leaders in a particular way. The analysis that they made about Mangaliso Sobukwe is that he is cut from a different cloth. And cut from a different cloth in the sense that one of the things, he is not enticed by shiny things, like many of the leaders we have today and even at the time, the shiny things, and whether it's money, but also the flashy lifestyle. Today it's cigar puffing and whiskey sipping. They noticed that from an early age, he was not excitable. And it was then difficult for them to either control or influence him. So they've studied him for a long time. And I can bet my last cent, there is a bigger file that the apartheid police have on him. A much, much bigger file. Because if you look at everything that was done to him by the system throughout his life, you could tell that he was given specialized attention by the apartheid system. And that can only come from the fact that they have studied him as a person. And so they tailor-made their terror for him. And this was because they noticed that he was at the level of people like Thomas Sankara, right? People like Thomas Sankara, Amilcar Cabral, Samora Machel, Eduardo Mondlane, right? People who are incorruptible, who can't be bought, who can't sell their souls. And then if you don't eliminate them, you must find a way of rendering them useless or humiliating him. So he was, without doubt, one of the single biggest threats to the system of white supremacy as it manifested itself here. And here is why he was a threat. He was a threat because he represented something that many black people aspire to, right? He had a dignity and a fearlessness about him in whichever space that he moved. And he never felt the need to make others feel his presence, yet they felt his presence. A man like that is extremely dangerous, who does not need the validation or the affirmation of other people. Such a man is very dangerous. Now, the leaders that are easy to control, right, are those leaders who behave like beauty contestants, who need people to say, oh, number one, oh, you look nice, and what. He was not a political beauty contestant. And for me, from what I know, that is the threat that he represented. And leaders like him get assassinated. Assassinations are reserved for leaders like him. And for me, that is the biggest lesson that we must learn, that he had something in him that made the system realize that he is not afraid of the system, but at the same time, he can exist in spite of the system. He can exist. He doesn't need the system to affirm it. That's why one of the things he said when he went to court, he said he does not recognize the authority of the court over him. This is also why he did not think twice about resigning his position at Wits, right? So he did not think, what will people say when I go around and I'm no longer a Wits graduate? Like we have today, people who fight about the thing. When you speak to me, I'm a graduate of this and the other institution. Those are the things we must learn about, the difference between substance and hot air. He was able to understand that other things, it's hot air, and other things, and you must focus on substance. He was a man of substance. So as it relates to your question about whether we should accept that he died really of, lung-related illnesses, as they say, right? Now, it is important, again, as Black people, because we have a particular history in the world. So we must look at things through the lens of that history and don't just be amorphous and just look at things and think things are what they are. Things are not what they appear to be for us as Black people. So a person of the stature, of the caliber, Kababu Mangaliso Sobukwe, right, who is viewed as a threat to the system will explore multiple ways of eliminating him. And whatever the system tells us, remember they told us through their surgeons who certified them, right, that he died of respiratory or lung-related illnesses, right? Given our history, and we've seen what we have seen, we must not accept that until we have been able to ascertain for ourselves through our own surgeons, through our own doctors, right, who have the proper orientation and not just the medical training, but also have the political understanding within which this medical training happens. Because there are many of our leaders, right, who were killed and their death certificate said it was one or the other illness, but they were actually killed. And I often share the story, which is a very recent one, of the leader of Hamas, Khalid Mishal, who was almost killed by the Israeli intelligence Mossad through a chemical agent that could mimic medical conditions. And it would have said that he would have died to multiple organ failure if this was not discussed. So we know those things, right? And so for me, I'm one of those, and I must state it openly, I am not convinced that Mangaliso Sobukwe died of what we were told. And just like his cause of death, a number of things relating to his life need to be investigated anew, to tell that story. But here is the biggest tragedy, is that as we also ask the question about whether or not he died of what they said he died of, we must also remember one thing, that the system went out of its way to torture and humiliate him. So they took him first from his home. They took him he was incarcerated briefly in Pretoria and then taken to Robben Island. And when they took him from Robben Island, they did not take him back to his family. They took him to where he has no immediate family, Galeshewe, as part and parcel of the strategy to torture the man to death by denying him access to the people that he regards as his immediate family. But here's another thing we don't say. The Sobukwe family, the children, Gababu Sobukwe, the mother of these children, Nkosikazi Gababu Sobukwe, suffered even more, not knowing where their father is, not knowing what their father is eating, right? Suffered even more. And they also now finding themselves having to be uprooted and having to move and now having to come to Galeshewe. And that's the other cost we don't talk about. So when you talk about his sacrifices, you must also look at it in the context of what his family went through. And that trauma, as you know, is what we carry intergenerationally in our veins. The trauma ka Sobukwe, the trauma ka Steve Biko, the trauma ka Krisani, the trauma ka Thomas Sankara, the trauma ka Kwame Nkrumah. We carry that in our veins as Africans. And this is why many of the things that are happening in our countries, right, are things that we can't explain, because we have not dealt with the trauma that we have been put through the processes of slavery and colonialism, because those traumas continue, and they continue to shape us in the way that we relate with each other. And this is why we as Black people continue to be so violent and toxic towards each other. It's because we are a people who come from a furnace of trauma, and we have not made that acknowledgement, and we have not sought to correct that. Mangaliso Sobukwe, all of that converged on his body. So he went to his grave a battered and bruised man, because he did not just carry his own trauma. He carried the trauma of his wife, Umamuzondeni, He carried the trauma of his children, because as a proud family man, he had to deal with the reality that he can't provide for his family, but also he can't see his family because there is this group of invaders that have decided what they are going to do with his life. There is no greater torture than that. So what honor do we think uMangaliso Sobukwe deserves, right, in current times? So the first thing I would say is that as self-respecting Black people, we must apologize to Sobukwe for allowing him to be erased. We must apologize to him. Did so much for us, suffered immeasurable pain for us, and we owe him an incalculable debt of gratitude, and we must be decent enough to say to him, we are sorry that we as Black people, right, not as the government or anything, have not done enough to make sure that his name is not forgotten, and most importantly, that our children don't know about him. There is no deeper or greater erasure than my and your children not knowing the people who lived and died for us. There's no greater erasure. And I don't know if we can honor Sobukwe. I honestly don't know. But what I know in my heart of hearts is that we owe him an incalculable apology. He and many others, who made the sacrifices that he has made, we owe them a profound apology. I don't know how that apology can be actualized, but we owe him and others like him a profound apology. And we must perhaps converge as Black people one day at his grave and go and apologize and say, we are sorry, we have forgotten you, and we have allowed our children to forget you. And maybe therefrom, we would be able to decide what next to do. Thanks.